So good morning, everyone, and thanks, Joanne, for organizing this. Very nice to see this really, really nice crowd here. Well, it's kind of hard to be the first presenter. I don't see all the other ones, but I'm going to do my best to kind of set the stage for the next few days, and I will talk about, really some foundational questions that I'll be raising, and some, remarks, some thoughts on the future of discovery. As you can tell from the title, we're trying to figure out how do we build, really intelligent AI, no pun intended, that actually can teach us something new. And as you know, if you look at the sort of the history of how we have, that's okay, I'll use a manual clicker here. The history of how the world sort of came about. You can think about it as sort of creating the material world itself. We had, sort of evolved as a species to make use of the world, I guess, building tools and machinery and things like this. And I think what we're really right now witnessing is that we're able to create machines, systems, synthetic constructs that actually, can imagine themselves, and it can also design new things themselves, okay? And they can do this already today. You think about AI writing code and executing the code, programming a robot, experiencing the world, and really sort of, creating through this process innovation and discovery. And that's the main thesis, I think, what I'm trying to convey is, there's obviously many aspects to this, and we won't talk about all of them, but I'd like to take a very positive look on this, is if we can figure out how to automate discovery and make it abundant, we can solve any problem we want. Anyone can, in fact, and that's a really empowering sort of future I think we can see there. As individuals, we'll be able to do things just we couldn't do before, and it gives us sort of this superpower. Of course, that's what we want to be, right? And so the first thing I want to talk about a little bit is, where are we today, and then what are we seeing today? And I think if you, and you probably hear about this in this conference, maybe more from an engineering perspective, but broadly in AI, you're seeing a lot of headlines, right? Like this. This is more about 10 years ago. AI beating the best Go player in the world. On the right-hand side, this is the news from this year. AI winning gold medals in math, okay? And then you see everyday headlines like this, AI is beating the benchmarks or saturating the benchmarks and stuff. And it sounds really cool, but as we probably all know in this room, and maybe if you don't, then maybe you can think about it, these are all, really impressive things, but they're really not discovery problems. They're not open-ended. Many of them are close problems, like math. You can essentially you can test it right away. Of course, scientific discovery is very different, right? Or innovation, or engineering. It's not something that exists or have never been built in engineering. It's something you imagine could be built, and then you have to kind of figure out how to do that. But AI is not very good at that, so it's really, really good retrieving things, okay? And that's really what we are. So the things we do in the lab is spend a lot of time, probably most of our time, trying to figure out how do we build AI or model systems that can actually teach us something new. What are the principles there? And a few things I always say is, people always talk about data, and I always make the counterpoint and say, well, data isn't really everything. In fact, we're never going to have enough data. Data alone cannot bring us out of this problem, that we can't really create discovery. I think we can, produce more and more data, like in biology or manufacturing, or maybe other things, sensors in cities and things like this. But it doesn't really help us sort of really solve the problem I think we really got to do, and that is, the two components, I would say, really of human intelligence. And that doesn't mean we're going to build synthetic intelligence like us, but at least what makes us different. Why can we innovate, right? Why can we be scientists and discover new things? And one of the two components, right? One is we're able to reduce complexity to principles. Like prototypically would be, finding an equation, right, and then using the equation to do compositional reasoning. And so say, oh, I know a principle, and I can solve a new boundary condition. That's a very simple one. Or I can come up with, in art, creation of new ideas. I can combine principles in really novel ways, and I can do it in a reasoned way, not just randomly, actually, reason. So those are two things I think we're missing in today's AI. So I made a little, actually, picture this morning. Hopefully, it's more clear. So for today's AI, really, we're just learning from the data, and we're approximating the data, right? That's sort of the easy path, right? And it's not enough. We got to create this tension here between reductionist and compositional principles. It's much harder for something to learn that. a machine to learn this. But ultimately, something like this is necessary to really go beyond the training distribution. So you hear me say this a lot. So I'll show you many examples as well, but this is sort of how the world looks like to me. And in a way, the problem spaces we're interested in, like Brian said, we're looking at materials. They're really complex systems. They're hierarchical. What it means is they're not just hierarchical in a sense that they, have atoms and molecules and other building blocks. They actually have relationships, interactions across scales that are not obvious, non-trivial. Right? You might have an atom, a single atom that's really important for the function of something, and other atoms don't matter, right? So there's not just simply hierarchical structuring that we usually think about it, but actually it's very complex. And so for the early days, in the 1950s, computational modeling, we're trying to basically build models atom by atom, trying to figure out how do we, maybe simulate our way out of this. And I've gotten involved in this in 2000, right? When I did my PhD, and we thought, this is potentially very powerful, right? But of course, you can never again scale your way out of this because you're just brute force computing maybe motions of molecules and atoms. It's a powerful tool, but really doesn't get you really to the meta learning. And that's what I got interested in about 2010. I became interested in this because I realized that, the way I think about a problem when I give a talk about, let's say, spider silk, I'm not telling you about the motion of every single atom, right? And then I'm just going to spend an hour reading all the dynamical trajectories of these. No, I'm actually going to tell you about principles. I'm going to tell you about scaling laws and motifs, maybe certain relationships that are really critical, and I'll give you kind of an informed perspective. And so we're trying to figure out how can we model this actually, right? This discovery process, and that's sort of kept us really busy. So we did some early work in 2010 using mathematical concepts called category theory, and I'll show you more on this later, to kind of get this kind of stuff. This is an actual spider web being created by a spider. And there's no hope, there's no law here. So can we not just reproduce this in a model, but actually understand the principles? How did the spider do this? What decisions did the spider make? And why do these structures come about? So this is an actual scan of a spider web built by the spider. And it's fascinating, but a complexity, right? It's very, very high. So, I think when I always like to think about sort of to make this point again, what's different from brute force or machine learning or even just modeling by writing code and letting computers execute the code is that, we're very good in abstractions, right? We can do logic, right? And there's many examples, We also figured out, I think, in maybe a few hundred years ago at least, or maybe before, but a few hundred years ago formally, that in science you really need to look at differences. You need to understand what are the things that are shared principles, what are things that are different, right, between different systems. And so this really is how we do science, and that's how we discover the world. And a lot of the early, I would say, kind of work, in neural networks, machine learning, totally ignore that, right, that principle, because they basically approximate the world as a closed system, and they imagine the world can be modeled. But of course, discovery, requires an outside perspective, right? It's not enough to just have an internal viewpoint. And so this is something that we are, thinking very hard about. How do we do this? And one way, to formally mathematically ground the work is in sort of the math of math, which is category theory. So as I mentioned earlier. So this is how we started doing this in 2010. And there's obviously not enough time to really go into everything. I'm probably behind already in what I wanted to say. But the point is that you want to kind of have a formalism where you can understand isomorphisms, that is, things that are shared between very different systems, and what are the mappings between them, right? Between, let's say, music and structure, materials and language and other things. And back in those days, we did this manually, meaning sort of by hand, writing analytical equations and, functors and relationships and things like this. And it was very successful because I could basically condense the things I would give a talk about spider silk into a graph, right? And I can actually sort of capture this very central relationship in an effective way. And we'll come back to this later. You have to compress the information, right, in a very high density of expression. And coming back to this, I think if you think about sort of differentiation, sort of the finding differences and finding similarities is really, I think, most beautifully expressed in differential equations. Right? That was the first time I think humans really figured that out. And I think we didn't figure it out actually at that time that this is a principle. We just found a way of writing the behavior of systems, dynamical systems, the world, with these differential operators. And we have kind of now, I think, opportunity to go back to this actually as we model intelligence itself. So that's the thesis behind what we're doing. And of course, when you do this, you have a couple of things you need to kind of unlearn, I think. One is you can't really train a model, right, on data and then expect it to discover things outside of the training distribution. It's maybe obvious, but not obvious to some actually. I think there's a lot of effort put into trying to do that, and I think it cannot work. So you have to have machines, systems, models, whatever you call it, that can learn obviously on the fly. They can adapt, and I think that's a consensus I think we're getting as a community now. That means you do some training, giving models some basic intelligence maybe, but then you also let them evolve, and they actually really learn about the world doing the solution of the problem, right? Kind of like humans, except if we use, reinforcement learning techniques, for example. We don't have to, bias these machines to do what we think should be done. They can discover it on their own, right? That's the idea behind it. So this is, I think, the framework for a lot of the stuff we've been doing. And of course, nothing's ever new. That's part of category theory, right? In that, in fact, the early ideas, how people thought, oh, let's build AI in the 1950s and 60s was exactly this idea, right? And so, some of you, how many of you have been around back then? I haven't been around. Anyone from this time? Probably not. Okay, but back then it was a sort of great idea, right? And it didn't work. It basically became humans writing programs, if and then statements, literally, right? And then they would break as soon as something was slightly different. So it took another 50 years to actually, create these sort of symbolic methods and connect them, marry them with neural networks, which provides sort of a connective glue. It's like a glue, a connective tissue, right? So it's the relationship becomes, differentiable, if you wish, pun intended. And you can actually make these connections even in edge cases, because neural networks have an ability to extrapolate maybe some, and they can interpolate, right? And so they can make connections. And so this allowed us, I think, to build these systems now. Like this is a model we've built for protein design, and then many others in this field. And sort of the idea of having sort of self-organizing, problem solution strategies, that learn on the fly. Right? They learn from things they try, they experience, and it doesn't mean the experience has to be in the physical world. It could be in silico entirely. It's fine. But they have to sort of experience the world and update their beliefs. Biology does it the same way, right? So biology obviously, creates these evolving systems, and to give you kind of how many of you work in biomaterials or anything? Very few, okay. But if you're in bio, you know that biology doesn't engineer a new body every single time a human is born, right? I mean, it basically we reuse principles. Even our organs are made from the same stuff chemically. They just evolve to create new functions by putting the building blocks together slightly differently. And I think in engineering we're kind of want to do this, but it's hard to abstract that out and figure this out. Generally, though, I would say as a species, we are not doing this really well, right? We're highly inefficient in the sense that we're creating thousands of different materials for thousands of different functions, as opposed to sort of using what nature does. And intelligence is actually the same way. So the same story. We're building gigantic, some people call it foundation models or whatnot, but sort of trying to make this monolithic thing that is sort of very good in solving the problem, but actually that's not how we can create most intelligent materials, or most intelligence itself probably. And of course there are examples in biology like bones and growth and things like this. And actually this is a slide from my student Lee, who's right here. So something that Lee's actually interested in is figuring out how to extract some of those biological principles and how design works in nature or in biology, and then creating sort of a whole pipeline of extracting these principles and then being able to fabricate them. So I thought this is something interesting. So Lee's here, you can chat with her during the next few days. How this can be done. It can be end-to-end potentially, right? So you can have a machine that would, study nature and explore principles and ultimately come back and build something new that is compositionally created. So it extracts the principles like we showed earlier, and then it uses the principles to compose something totally new with a certain objective, right? It does it through thinking and reasoning, and in a more abstract way we call it compositional reasoning. So this is sort of the terminology, the technical term for this, where you have different components and they come together and form an answer. So there are many ways we can sort of approach this. One is thinking, okay, what if I take, hundreds of, intelligent agents and they come together and form a swarm, right? I'll show you this later. Yeah, that can work. You can have maybe reasonably intelligent systems that have some understanding of the world, and then they act in the world and they express ideas, they imagine things, they test them, and they learn. They can update their beliefs about how the world works. That's important. So they don't just come in and know everything, which is the current paradigm, but they actually become part of the solution, right? And they evolve, like insects, bees, and things. They're not born to build bridges. In fact, none of these elements actually, right, know that they're building a bridge. They just figure out how to do it through trial and error and adapting their own behaviors. And so, as a statistical mechanician, if you wish, sometimes I call myself that, because I come from stat-mech in molecular simulation, the world really becomes, I'm not just optimizing the particle, I'm optimizing the interaction, right? So there's the particle property, like what atoms do I put in? But if I want a certain structure, I really have to engineer the interactions and the emergent interactions. So it becomes like a problem, like how do I figure out how the same atoms interact slightly differently in creating a very different outcome, right? So this is sort of the design problem. So when you think about training a model, in quotation mark like this, you have to train them to achieve this set of outcome. And again, we want to do two components here. One is we want to kind of get the models to learn shared abstractions. So again, the idea of science being understanding differences and similarities, right? Which I think is the core of scientific inquiry and discovery. And you got to then kind of, use this structure to go outside the training distribution, right? That's the core. And if you want to go one level deeper, how we do it, well, we do it through graph representations, like I showed you with the categories. So we kind of think about not just memorizing the world as it is, or even using graphs that you might know, but discovering the graphs on the fly. So that's a key difference, right? So if you think about a molecule or a social network, and you would say, I'm going to put a graph on the friendships, right? Well, that's you telling the model, that's what I think the relationships are, but the latent relationships might be very different, right? There might be certain features and traits that are actually more important than others. And so what we really got to do, we got to build something that can discover the graph, and then we compute on the graph, right? And so we do both of these things. And if we do this, we can, build sort of at least individual components that are, pretty good in approximating the world. Like this is work by my student Jamie, who's been really fascinated with cell automata. How many of you worked in cell automata? I thought some of you do. Yeah. So those are kind of really interesting systems. They're like the simplest possible algorithm, I guess, to describe evolution of a dynamical system, if you wish, in that, or design maybe. And the experiment was, well, let's use some of those models, a neural network type approach, and let's see if we can learn these rules. And it can, to an approximation, right? So you saw from the title here, I said, it's an approximation. In fact, that's all it is, right? So we can we can never really learn the rule fully, right? We can approximate the rule. And we'll always find cases that are never been in the training data. And so now you can show, and this is the point of that paper actually, was to basically show that you can approximate the world, even for very, very simple systems, but you can never really understand it and never fully make predictions outside. And I think it's an important argument to make, actually, in the community. Then we thought, well, what about using some of the symbolic methods, like I mentioned earlier, right? So what if we were to use this kind of framework, but instead of just teaching the model to approximate the world directly, can we use a model like this to tell us the rules that govern the world, right? And that would be kind of extracting a symbolic representation of the dynamics. And that works okay. I mean, we can show in this, so we can do forward and inverse problems. So you give it a evolution of a system, right, a new frame, and the model will tell you, this is what I think is the best dynamical, rule to predict that next state in the system. And the more rules I use for training, the better performance becomes. And at some point, actually, and you can see this on the very right here, the model is able to, infer rules that have the same or similar behavior, right, as what they see, but they're different from the training data. So there's some sort of interpolation going on in this system, and so now you're beginning to have something that you can put into a more sophisticated learning strategy based on reinforcement learning. Because now you have an analytical expression of how the world evolves, and you can probe it and you can test it. You can see, is this actually true? And this is what the differentiation means. So I find a rule, and I can now form a hypothesis essentially based on this mechanism. And it's an actual hypothesis, not just a prediction, you know, from a black box, but it's an actual analytical expression. So that's the spirit of this work. So what do we do next? Well, I mean, basically, we want to go beyond this, right? So we want to kind of figure out how do we go outside the training data. And you know, one of the things we got to do is to use better training strategies. So instead of teaching the model through examples, we want to teach the model based on outcomes, right? And so we say, you know, I'm going to reward you if you figure out a good, you know, strategy to get to the answer, and I'm going to penalize you if you don't. And so that's very different from what we call supervised fine-tuning, which is most cases you need a lot of data for this. For reinforcement learning, actually, you don't need a lot of data, right? Because you're really teaching the model strategies. And if a model can do this well through abstractions, it can do a pretty good job. So that's sort of the approach we're doing a lot in these agentic systems. So there's different ways to get there. One is, in fact, sort of a multi-agent system. You know, many AIs talking to each other, negotiating, each developing its own strategy, each becoming a policy, right, to solve the problem. And this, you know, is fundamentally different from sort of traditional learning. I mean, this is one of the first papers where we did this in 23. And I basically, you know, I gave this model a task, and I said, you know, can you give me this energy landscape of this molecule? And if you were to take a traditional, I don't know, machine learning potential, or maybe like a traditional neural network, it would have given me an answer, even though the model has never seen this particular molecule in its training data. This model did something different. So I put together basically a system of agents, and it figured out that it doesn't know the answer. But it knows how to write a code, right, that runs a DFT simulation to generate new data, to then do the regression problem, right? So this sort of was eye-opening for me. And I mean, I've actually tried this for many years, and it could never work, right? And you know, at some point in 23, we had enough sort of baseline intelligent models that could do this, and it changed sort of the way we can think about problems, because now, you know, the machine actually, it writes a program, a code, it solicits new data, it has agency in the world, it can search the web, you know, the internet and things like this, and it can test hypotheses, and maybe what can we do with this? Well, so this was a toy problem in the beginning. We went on and did many different things with this. We built real multi-agent systems, meaning real that actually solve important problems, right? You know, like protein design, and with the amazing thing is, you know, suddenly, first of all, the model can make its own data, so you don't just train it and then you're done and you hope for the best. But hey, the model can run physics simulations. It can, you know, search the internet. It doesn't just, you know, the world through neural networks, like a large language model, is like seeing the world in a very fuzzy way, right? So it just sees the mundane, like average truths, right, which are the most established. And of course, there are edges in that world, you know, maybe data that's an outlier, that actually is the key to make a discovery. Or, you know, you have to be able to, have, you know, conflicting representations of the world. So neural networks are not very good at this because they're trained essentially to give you just the most likely outcome. So, and so this allowed us to change this. We also, the other really big thing here was that suddenly we were not just doing data-driven learning or physics, we could combine them, right? This model had a physics engine, it could run a simulation. And what I mean by this is the model actually, it would write its own code to run the simulation. It wasn't me telling the model, here's how you do it, but actually it could execute on its own. So it'd write the program, execute the program, collect the data, and do things. And you can do amazing things with this. So you can solve mechanics problems, design problems. Like here, the burden of, you know, sort of finding the perfect answer is gone because, you know, the system can negotiate solutions and error correct, right? So even if the answer initially is wrong, the code doesn't run, you know, there's context. The model can understand how to fix it. And it can, right? So there's this connective glue, actually, that makes these things work, and it can ultimately solve the problem through many, many iterations. So you might say, well, what's the catch here? One catch is compute, right? So NVIDIA will be very happy. I think we have some NVIDIA folks here. So it takes a lot of compute. But it means, actually, that you need less training because I can use this agentic system and I can solve this continuum mechanics problem today, and then maybe, this is another slide from Lee, you know, we can do an additive manufacturing design problem tomorrow. right? So it's very flexible. Some other students in my group have done work on applying these systems to Science by Design. This is work on using pollen particles in the specific domains, or connecting sort of a baseline intelligent model with a very specific domain with experimental partners. This is my student Rachel did this work, and then trying to figure out, okay, can we use agents like this to come up with creative new designs and creative new ways to actually conduct an experiment, and then go to the lab, okay, and then actually do this experiment there. And of course there are many components, and I'm just sort of flashing a couple of key ideas here. You have to create the model, right, the 3D architecture. You have to design the experimental plan. The models have to be able to see, right? They have to look at results and reason over them, right? Connect the dots between different concepts, and ultimately, they can execute, things internally in silico that they can then be put into the lab and actually validate, some of the design ideas and suggestions that come up. So this is very exciting. So it takes a lot of work, though. I mean, in this work, we spend as much time, maybe more, in the experimental side of things. This is experiments done by Namchu Cho, who's an expert in this particular, so it's a very particular field, right? Plant pollen-based materials. And why that? It's just somebody I know, and I like him, and we sort of formed the team together. But that's how you can really test sort of how these creative AI agent systems actually are working. The other thing that we're going to do, when you do things like this, you can do human experimentation, but of course you can also do lab experimentation autonomy. So this is something also we've been interested in, is to build, hardware that can be used, for autonomous collection of data, right? So this is also something a lot of people are doing right now. And one of the really important things here, I think, is open sourcing these things. So this printer we made, this is work by a former student, Jesse. So he, created this printer, built it, and then you can see a little bit in the flow chart. There's also paper which you can reference there. And it is open source, and it's not just like the code, but the entire manufacturing. So I think that's really important for the community to figure out how, so you can take this and make it, improve on it, put it back on GitHub, right, and or make your own GitHub repository, and then the community can involve. It's very important, I think, to have this in software and AI, machine learning, right? So PyTorch, TensorFlow, and the whole machinery around it. The reason why we're going so quickly in this is because we have a shared language we speak. We can all talk to each other. I was saying yesterday, right, I can read a code that an AI lab has created, and I can adapt this code to my own purpose, so I can improve on it. But in engineering, a lot of times it's not the case. We can't really talk to each other very easily. So this is very important. So, and hopefully maybe this community can sort of get excited about this. There are many other examples, of course, how we've been, building, solving problems using multi-agent systems. One is protein design. That's something we've done a lot of work in. Designing proteins with these systems, again, including Gen AI, reasoning, and physics, right? So these are not just predictions. They actually have a physical meaning because they've been validated. So there have been molecular simulations, statistical mechanics, to actually give us a signal whether a design actually makes sense or not, right? And so you can do this to whatever degree of perfection you want. We can also do this for different materials. We've done agent systems for alloy design, paper in PNAS. You can check it out. And we've done this even for scientific discovery. So the title of the talk really was about scientific discovery, framing it. But and I mean, absolutely, you can automate the entire scientific process now. That we can do. And what I mean by this is not just to create a design solution, which is not, I mean, just in quotation marks. It's very hard, but to actually come up with principles. So can the model teach us something about how the system works? Yeah. Thank you. Questions? Come on. Go in here front.
Yeah, that's a question about the music.